Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of Pride Reads, an LGBTQ plus reading series led by my colleague, Dr. Peter Grevstad, Professor of English and Literary Studies in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. I am Chrysula Benak, also a professor with the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and we would like to welcome our guest author this afternoon, Brian Francis, who will be speaking to us about his memoir, Missed Connections, a memoir in letters never sent. Let us begin with land acknowledgement. Let us acknowledge that this territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty and the Two-Row Wampum Treaty, which emphasize the importance of joint stewardship, peace, and respectful relationships. We recognize the land on which we gather has been and still is the traditional territory of several indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. As an institution of higher learning, Sheridan recognizes and embraces the critical role that education must play in facilitating real transformational change. We continue our collective efforts to recognize Canada's colonial history and take steps towards meaningful truth and reconciliation. Megwech, thank you. Brian Francis is the author of 3 novels: Break in Case of Emergency, Natural Order and Fruit, a memoir, Missed Connections, a memoir of letters never sent, as well as a performance piece, Box 4901. His books have been finalists for the Governor General's Literary Awards, the Trillium Book Awards, and the CBC Canada Reads. When Brian is not writing fiction, he's likely writing about food, specifically his taste tests, where he samples a variety of foods ranging from panettone to macaroni salad to determine which brand is best. Audience, please check out his author blog and his latest taste test. You can also check out his previous food blog, Cake or Cooking, for some, well, let's say non-gourmet fare. Brian is also a regular contributor to CBC Radio's The Next Chapter and writes a monthly advice column for writers for Quill and Choir. If you'd like to subscribe to his blog, see the contact information on his author's site. Today's talk is led by Dr. Peter Grevstad, who is a professor of English and Literary Studies in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. Peter has a BA bilingual and an MA from York University in English, as well as a PhD in education from the University of Toronto. At Sheridan, he teaches the First Ontario Community College course in Queer Studies. Regarding the book that we are discussing this afternoon, Missed Connections, is a sweet and heartwarming memoir told in the form of letters. In 1992, as a university student, Brian Francis placed personal ads in the local paper. Almost 30 years later, he comes across 13 responses to his ad that he never answered and decides to pen the answers to them from the perspective of his older, more experienced self. The result is a moving coming-of-age story about a young man in the process of coming out as gay, dealing with the effects of his conservative small-town upbringing, and his earnest and wholehearted search for love. We invite now Brian to offer us a brief reading from his memoir.
Thank you, Chrysula.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining us here today for this conversation. I'm happy to be here to be part of this reading series as well. I understand this is the second one, so I am happy to be here today and be talking to you a little bit about my memoir, Missed Connections. So I'm going to just read a brief sample for you. And when you do readings, it's always hard to decide where you want to start the reading and at what section, and sometimes you need a lot of background. So I'm just going to start from the beginning of the book, just with the introduction, and I'm just going to read a couple pages from that, just to sort of set the scene about what Missed Connections is about. In 1992, I placed a personal ad in the newspaper. I was 21 years old and had just started my 3rd year of university. For any Generation Z readers, 1992 was important historically, as it was the year that fire was invented, It was also
Mhm.
a year of pushing boundaries and challenging the establishment. Madonna came out with her book, Sex. Sinead O'Connor caused a maelstrom when she ripped up a photo of Pope John Paul II on Saturday Night Live. Charles and Diana officially announced their separation after years of scrutiny. And the tribute concert for Freddie Mercury, who had died from AIDS the previous year, was broadcast to 1 billion people worldwide. In addition, the World Health Organization declassified homosexuality as a mental illness. In my corner of the world, in a mid-sized city in southwestern Ontario, some other significant changes were taking place. I had just started the process of coming out. Not that the closet doors had flung wide open or anything, it was more of a gradual squeak, as these sorts of things tend to go. One of my sisters knew, as well as some of my high school friends, and the people I met via the local gay scene knew, but my parents didn't know, and the straight guys I shared a house with didn't know. So I was in a state of precarious balancing, one foot planted in secrecy and the other foot in honesty, straddling two worlds, not unlike many queer people in their early days of emergence. My classified ad ran for 3 issues and cost $65, which was a lot of money for me, especially in those student days. I was perpetually broke. I ate sardine sandwiches. I smoked my cigarettes only halfway to make them last longer. I bought clothes on Friday, wore them to the bar on Saturday, and returned them on Monday. I was constantly on the phone to my parents asking for loans. The money I'd saved during the summer while working in Chemical Valley in my hometown of Sarnia, Ontario, and which was to have lasted me throughout the school year, had suddenly and inexplicably run low. But Brian, my dad would say, it's October. As to why I would have sunk that kind of cash into a personal ad rather than spend the money on something more practical, like a new pirate shirt,
I
this was
used to
the
have
early
one.
this was the early 90s after all. I can only explain my actions by saying that I was desperate for love. It was something I had never experienced. Lust? Absolutely. Hurt? Are you kidding me? But romantic love and everything I imagined it would feel like had eluded me. What I craved more than anything was security and reassurance of being accepted, a connection. I wanted to see someone looking back at me and know that I was loved for who I was, not for whatever I'd been masquerading as up until that point in time. In retrospect, I don't think I would have recognized Prince Charming even if he had come galloping along on a white horse with a box of pot of gold assorted chocolates tucked under his arm. What did I know about love at 21? What could I have known after having to grapple with the shame, fear, and suffocating isolation that came with growing up gay in a small city? I was surrounded by a brick wall, one that I'd been constructing since my childhood, although I didn't realize it, nor did I realize how thick and high the wall was. In spite of my feelings of wrongness, of never being good enough or valued or equal, I still somehow believed in love, specifically gay love. This desperation is raging, I wrote to my journal. I'm clinging to scraps of hope. But the ad was also about excitement and an adventure. I placed it to see what was possible. For so long, I'd kept gay men at a distance. It was a guilt by association thing. Now that I was coming into my own, now that I was starting to feel comfortable in my own skin, I became increasingly curious. Who was out there? So that's just a little bit from the book.
Thank you so much, Brian. I really love that. The idea of the brick wall, and the question that you asked is, what could I have known after having to grapple with the shame, fear, and suffocating isolation that came with growing up gay in a small city, surrounded by a brick wall? That's powerful. And I think a lot of young people can identify with that statement or that comment. So it's an excellent metaphor. Excellent. So congratulations on that. And thanks for the reading.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. All right. So I think I started, I don't know how I got my hands on Natural Order, but I know I've read it. And then after that, I read Fruit, which is a memoir that Brian wrote, sort of from the same era, I would suggest. And the subtitle is A Novel About a Boy and His Nipples. And this was a Canada Reads selection. And then I found out that Brian had done a third volume, or this one, the memoir Misconnections. I found that out through dog walking because I know people who work for publishers. So who was it? This is with McClellan and Stewart. Yeah. So it was great. And by the way, if there are questions, we have the chat enabled, but we're going to wait. We're not going to do a formal Q&A, but I do see that there are chat participants already. We'll wait until the interview is concluded, and then we will answer some of the questions unless they're hugely pressing. All right? So you ready, Brian?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. So as I said, I read your first book, Fruit, and I found it like cringy, but also like I laughed out loud a lot. Well, because as a gay man, and of maybe perhaps close to the same generation, we have similar social experiences and came up, the time of Madonna, Live Aid, and you talk about Freddie Mercury dying and all of this stuff. And it was really just the kind of cringy, but also very honest narration of what it is to be a young person and then having to make some tough choices about identity and identity formation. So I know it's sometimes tragic, sometimes confusing, but I would congratulate you on it being definitely empathetic as a memoir of your younger life. A lot of people would beat themselves up. Your character is really likable, and I think a lot of young queer people see themselves in you. So what led you to writing a second memoir? Because you've done Fruit that met with success and awards, and what led you to undertake Misconnections?
Well, I think first and foremost, I should just clarify. So Fruit is fiction. I mean, I did certainly draw on my own experiences growing up in Sarnia in the 80s, but it's a fiction book. So in terms of memoirs, Misconnections is sort of my only nonfiction book that I've written. And I think for me, what it was I think all of us have stories of our lives and our upbringing. And I think there's a time in our lives where we start to kind of look back as opposed to looking forward. And I think for so long in my life, it was always about looking forward. It was about going to school, and then it was about getting a job, and it was like finding a relationship, finding some measure of success. And then if you're lucky, you kind of achieve that at some point. And then sometimes when you're at a place of comfort, or you feel like you've kind of reached a point in your life, you tend to sometimes look back on your life and the years behind you. And I think it's easy for all of us to maybe not value our stories. We don't all have to be mountain climbers. We don't all have to be, people that have led these really exciting, dramatic lives. For our own stories to have value, and to sort of look and look back on our own experiences and understand how we are the people that we are today. And I don't know that I ever really considered how my upbringing growing up when I did informed who I was today as a person. And if nothing else, I think memoirs in general, whether it's you're a writer or whether it's just something that you want to do on your own time, help give some shape and help give some structure to your own life in some ways. And if you're looking to understand maybe the way that you are, the things that you feel, or you might have recurring issues in your life, whatever, writing things down and understanding your perspective is a great way to kind of help understand where you are currently in the present and how you ended up to where you are, and whatever those struggles and successes might be that you're experiencing.
So it can be intensely therapeutic, is what you're saying.
I think so. And I think in a lot of us maybe don't oftentimes give our lives a lot of the thought that they deserve, or the care that they deserve. Like the idea of going back into the past for some people can be stressful, and I understand that. In other ways, the past can also shed answers into your present as well. And I don't think that I ever really understood where I was situated growing up either. Like I grew up in the 80s. I grew up in the 70s, but I was an adolescent in the 80s when AIDS was sort of everywhere. It sort of was just this, and there was so much ignorance, and there was so much like horrible things about AIDS and that generation that it affected. And then I was the generation that came afterwards. So when I came out, it was in the early 90s, and we had education and everything was about condoms. And I think that moment in time was a very unique moment in time for people to come out, because it was sort of that generation that followed that 80s decade of just so much, terrible tragedies and misinformation and ignorance. And then we were finally coming beyond that. And I think it was an interesting place for me to look at to understand my own position, where I was when I came out, and what was going on in the world at that time.
Right. Sounds like Michael Ondaatje, who taught me years ago at Glendon at York, had a Toronto novel called Coming Through Slaughter. And I mean, I think you can also, or almost think about it that way. Part of my academic work focuses on the idea. I did a thesis about queer and coming out and identity in the community college or in higher education in Canada. And looking at that, it's all about identity formation. And it's a really lonely and confusing time. And if you're different or gender diverse, you're not exactly going to go to your teacher and say, I kind of like Mark over there, what should I do about
Mm.
it? I mean, versus sort of, Wittig and others talk about compulsory heterosexuality, where all of that is automatically celebrated. So it's a brave stroke to do that. But do you think is it meant to inspire young people to understand that everyone has a really awkward time in their life as a teenager?
I think so. I think everybody's kind of universal, right? I think everyone has their own personal struggles. I think for me, what I realized when I look back on my teenage years and what in my adolescence, and what made it so challenging was that I was kind of a lockdown fortress. Like, I was not letting anybody into my internal world at all. And I think that that's something that's common sometimes with adolescence, because you're afraid to let people know you're the real you, because you open yourself up to being ridiculed or being shunned, or whatever the case may be, and because
Being
there's a lot of
physically hurt,
insecurity.
being hurt or
Exactly.
injured
Yep.
by people.
Exactly. And insecurity, right, with who you are as a person. And I know that for myself, I let other people's opinions dictate how I felt about myself. It was the world having their conversation about who I was and my value, and I allowed that to inform me. And it was only when I was older that I was in a better place that I realized, like, how much of the world I allowed to define me rather than me defining myself. And that was kind of a moment where I just you really take control of your life at that point in time, when you really define yourself on your own terms, not on everybody else's terms. But I spent so long dealing with that growing up, for sure.
But a lot of young people feel like they don't have a voice. And if
Hmm.
you ask them, they'd often say they have nothing to say.
Hmm.
And I stumbled upon something from my teaching, and it's something I start with every semester now. Usually there's this process where someone will go around and say, okay, on a card, everybody write the most interesting or cool thing you've ever done in your life, and then we're going to try to figure out who it is and get the story. And of course, that's a ton of pressure for people, because not everybody has, not everyone's jumped out of a helicopter or been to Southeast Asia or any of these other things. So what I have my students do is share one boring fact about themselves. What's one boring fact about you, Brian?
Oh, a boring fact about me. Let me see here. I like to watch, especially around this time of year, I like to watch just bad horror movies. I don't know what it is. I just, I know the plot. I know they're not worth watching, but for whatever reason, I just find myself watching them, and I don't know why. Is that boring enough, I guess, maybe to know that I watch bad horror movies?
On Facebook, there's a group called Dull Men's Club, and I think that might qualify.
That might- I'll sign
Um,
up for it.
but yes, okay. Now, and I was going to relate something to you. We were talking before we came live, and you were talking about this feeling of being young and queer and feeling like you might have been the only person in a city or a place or in school where you didn't feel like anyone else really was like you or understood you. So that is identity formation. But sometimes for queer people, of course, the idea is that's a much longer process. It starts around puberty, when you're like, I'm not like everybody else. And then it
Mm.
goes right through until you're coming of age. And of course, your early years. So this is not uncommon as a journey. But there was a big bump in the road along the way, and it was a health issue. And I'll talk about that in just a second, but I remembered an anecdote I wanted to share with you. So you talked about, how you felt growing up being lonely and queer and overweight and not liking school. and feeling stigmatized. And it reminded me of something Dick Cavett, the ultimate interviewer, once had James Baldwin on. And he was interviewing James Baldwin, and he looks at James Baldwin very seriously, and he says, "So, you were born poor, Black, and gay. How did that make you feel?" And he said, "Like I'd hit the jackpot, actually." This was in the 1960s. I love this anecdote. But when you were a young person, you got gynecomastia. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I mean that's sort of the basis of fruit in a lot of ways. It, you read the tagline, which is a novel about a boy and his nipples, and that was kind of the whole thing with my first book, and I talk a little bit about it in the memoir as well. So when I was going through puberty, I went through this. I got this condition called gynecomastia. I don't even know if I'm saying it right. It was like one of those big, long kind of terms. I didn't know what it meant, but basically it meant that there was, as you're going through puberty, there's different levels of testosterone and estrogen that are, I guess, are going through your body. And at some point, sometimes the estrogen starts to win,
Surge.
I guess. Yeah. And so what happens is that for boys, like as when girls start to develop like breasts at a certain age, the same thing can happen with boys, where there's sort of like a swollenness or a tenderness around the chest area. And for me, I mean, I was overweight. So at the time I was always sort of a little bit hefty up top, if you will. But then these became very noticeable. And I kind of compared them to like the ends of badminton birdies, without getting in too much detail, they became sort of like very pronounced. And
You
so
were
I
taping.
did.
You were
And
taping.
yeah, and this is the thing, like it wasn't like I'm questioning, this condition. All I can think about is to hide this from my colleagues or from my classmates, because it was like the worst thing I could possibly imagine for myself, right on top of all these other body issues that I'm dealing with growing up. Now I have this to contend with. So I used to kind of bind myself with tape to try to keep, things at bay. And I think that was just sort of one more area where growing up as a boy, I just felt like my body was constantly at odds with me, whether it was my weight for sure, my gynecomastia for sure, my thinking, the way that I saw myself and I perceived myself, although it wasn't necessarily physical. Well, I would actually say it was physical, because there's the way that you act, your physicality, certainly as an adolescent boy, sometimes will draw attention. And I always say it was sort of the wrong type of attention, but you couldn't cross your legs a certain way. There was a certain way that you had to carry your binder in class. You could never sort of hold it against your chest. Like, there were all these sort of cues that boys had to follow. And I always had to be mindful of that, because my inclination sometimes was to not sort of have this typical male behavior, because I was struggling a little bit with feminine masculine traits back then, certainly. So yes, the gynecomastia, coupled with my body image, coupled with the fact that I felt like I had to kind of lock myself down and watch every move, put me in a bit of a pressure cooker, I would say, growing up, where I just felt extremely self-conscious about myself growing up. That was just across the board for sure.
Of course, now they've got shaping garments and things that people can wear.
They do. I know. Exactly. Well, and people talk about, binding, and I guess that's really what it was back then as well. Like it was, I didn't realize it at the time, but I mean, certainly that was the way that I could survive. And I think that's the thing when you're an adolescent or you're a teenager, all you can think about is making it through the day, and you do whatever you need to do to get through the day. You don't question, is this right? Why do I need to do this? Like, why is this the thing? Why can't I just sort of be accepted for who I am? There's no debating that, unfortunately. And I think that was one of the biggest tragedies for me anyway, growing up, was I just never stopped to question or to consider that I was okay with who I was. I always felt like I had to sort of hide and cover myself up.
And that's very common. I wanted to discuss too, you called adolescence a batshit time, and I think we can agree. I don't know anybody who had a sort of textbook Disney style, youth or teenage years. So I think everyone, and I think a lot of us revel in being miserable and listening to sad music by ourselves,
Yeah.
right? But something else you talked about, and we just touched on it a second ago, is body image more urgent for young queer people? Like, do you think there's more pressure for young queer people to be the presentation you want to be, or to be seen in a certain way, or to not be seen in a certain way?
I think so. I think probably queer people in general are more aware of their physicality in some ways, right? And I think it's something that if you're comparing yourselves against what's acceptable or what's sort of the norm, it's
Mhm.
hard not to feel self-conscious about your body and your physicality and who you are as a person. So I definitely think that that is kind of part and parcel of growing up queer, that there's the interior world and the struggle that you have with that, but also your exterior world, right? And how you move about in that world and how you move in terms of how you express yourself and the things that you say and the things that you think. It's just constantly, I know for myself, it was just always under, I was putting myself under such scrutiny, I guess you could say, and comparing myself to what was considered to be normal behavior. So absolutely, I think that's very true.
The normal behavior of other confused teenagers, right?
Well, this is, yeah, yeah.
You also you discuss the idea of being straight acting. Personally, I don't like the term. I'm not comfortable with it. How do you feel about that? Do you think that
Well,
there's great pressure to be straight acting as a young queer person?
I don't know if it's still as much of a thing as it used to be, but I mean, certainly when I was coming out, there was if you could pass as straight, you were seen as more successful, that you were seen as you were able to kind of maneuver through the two worlds in a lot of ways. And that certainly was not, looking back on it, you can sort of see the BS for what it is. But
Yeah.
there was this sense of if you could kind of if you could get by in the straight world and not kind of raise any eyebrows, especially when you were closeted, and you could also
Right.
sort of, exist in the gay world, it was this idea of straight acting was sort of an accomplishment, perceived as an accomplishment. I'm not saying it was, because it was a lot of BS, right? I mean, what does straight acting mean? What does gay acting mean? So
Even
I'm
the straight
hoping,
boys were doing it's performativity and what Judith Butler talks about, performing a gender. Even the straight boys did it maybe to a much greater degree because they had to be tough and bully people and all of that.
yeah,
And
yeah,
then that became this sort of straight acting, which allowed people to turn around and start to stigmatize the gender diverse people and say, you don't act straight. And so therefore, but I also asked that in the context of personal ads, because I remember, when personal ads were really a thing in like Now Magazine, et cetera, and you'd
yeah.
read a lot of interest and people would always insist on straight acting. Do you think that's kind of insulting?
Yeah, absolutely. But that was this thing where it was this idea, and I still think it's still prevalent. I think in that, unfortunately, I still think it's something that does come up, right? Like
Oh, yeah.
masculine or feminine. I think it's one of those things where it's. I think we need to sort of ask ourselves, what does straight acting actually mean? And I think it it means that you have to sort of, to your point, put on some sort of an act, or you have to sort of behave in a certain way that others will find more acceptable or others will find safer to be around. Like, I'm not really sure where it came from, but it was more a sense that I think if you were straight acting, you were not gay acting, and gay acting was bad. And I think that was kind of the inherent message behind all of it. So I'm hoping that it has lessened a little bit in terms of the younger generation, and that there's not as much of a stigma around what is sort of queer acting or what is straight acting. And I hope it's a little bit more fluid than it used to be, but I'm sure there are instances where it's not. I'm
Well,
certain that that stuff still exists.
I'm a little bit more optimistic because I'm teaching queer studies, have been since I finished my dissertation. And a lot of the young people who I come across don't necessarily present as sometimes strictly one gender or the other. And especially since pandemic, where people started to say, you know what? We went all that time without cutting our hair and not seeing people, and so that really changed how we present ourselves in public, I think. And I think that's positive because I
Mhm.
think a lot of people no longer care about the perceptions of others. Anyway, let's move on because I've got a ton of questions. But you wanted a Barbie at one point and your mother said no.
Mhm.
What kind of Barbie
She
did you
did. I think it was a knockoff Barbie. I don't even think it was like a real Barbie. I remember having this conversation with her in the department store because I wanted a Barbie at a young age, and she refused. She just said, no, that boys don't play with Barbie dolls. And so that was kind of for me a very significant moment because it was my mom correcting me in terms of my behavior as a boy. Like, there were very sort of clear guidelines as to what was acceptable if you were a boy and what was acceptable if you were a girl. And certainly toys were a strong indication of that, that boys played with trucks and they played with, army
guns? Yeah.
figurines and GI Joes or whatever. Everything was about violence and weapons and whatever. and girls would play with dolls. But if you were a boy and you expressed an interest in potentially wanting to play with a doll, I think sometimes that seemed to cross the line of, and I could tell my mom's discomfort over the fact that I was, that I was a boy and I wanted a Barbie doll. It was not a negotiable at all. Like, it just was not a thing.
Did you sense disapproval or embarrassment, or she just wanted to get through the moment and just get out of there?
Yeah, I think it was more like it was I'm uncomfortable by this, by the request. This isn't normal behavior, and I feel like I should put him in his place to make sure that he knows that this isn't right for him to be asking me for one. Like, I think that was kind of the mentality behind it, rather than just giving in and giving me the Barbie doll.
But then you met a kid who had a Cabbage Patch doll.
Yes, yeah. And that was kind of a significant moment as well, because I remember that as well. It was a young boy who had a Cabbage Patch doll, and it was at church. And I was older by that point in time. I was around 12 or 13 or so. And I remember seeing this boy with this Cabbage Patch doll, and he was just so not conscious of the fact that he had a doll, or nobody else seemed to be bothered by it. But I remember thinking like how that would have made me feel had that been normalized when I was growing up, that it wasn't this shocking thing that I wanted a Barbie doll as a boy, which is what it made me feel, right? That's kind of that moment in your life and your development where you realize that there's something that's not quite right about you, when it's your parents that need to feel that they have to correct you, or that your colleagues, or your classmates or your teachers or whatever, there's always this sense of correction that, whatever you are is wrong. So we need to put you on the right path. So
why are you doing this? Why are you doing this?
Yes. Or why aren't you playing sports? Or why aren't you like the other boys, is kind of what the refrain was when I was growing up a lot of the time, where I was constantly compared to, other boys who were doing things like going to hockey and playing sports and dating girls or whatever. And I was never doing any of that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But they didn't really ever, your parents didn't ever really inquire, or were there, I mean, we're from the same era. So, you go to the school dance with your friends or something, and then your mother's, did you meet anybody pretty tonight? Was there that kind of thing?
I don't remember too much pressure. I had a lot of girlfriends. I put that space between
Friend
those
girls.
words.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so I think maybe there was this kind of idea that maybe I was seeing one or two of them on the side,
Popular,
but I never
kind of girls.
Exactly. Yeah. But even that was like something I was always self-conscious about as well, because you had to be careful about the kind of attention that you drew to yourself. And if you were a boy who had too many girls who were friends, yeah, exactly, then you sometimes would draw, people would, make comments or whatever. So there was also this again, who you hung out with and who you were friends with, which was another indicator of potentially something that other people might notice and make you a target.
But even so, I think some of us in that era found unlikely allies before we understood what an ally was. And we found friend groups, mixed friend groups, where it didn't matter so much and we didn't talk about this. We were just good friends. I had that experience by the time I was in high school, which was really great. But back to the doll thing. Poor you. You see, I have 4 sisters, so I had access to like every girl toy under the sun, including the Easy Bake Oven, whatever it was. All that stuff was around. But you had a sex talk with your father, and this is from page 64 of the book. And you said that it didn't go well for you, and you don't want to paint an unfair picture of him, you say. Why not?
Well, I think he was a product of his time. I mean, the thing is, growing up in the 70s, there was no there might have been gay rights. Like, I'm sure that there was some movement, but it was not. There was no movement.
1969, and Canadians didn't know about it.
Well, this is it. I mean, we were living in isolation, and anytime that you saw a representation of anyone who was queer on television, they were always the punchline. So you had Jack Tripper on Three's Company, that kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink, that it was assumed that he was gay. And that's how we got to live with the girls in the house, like, or in the apartment. Then you had your Paul Lynde on your center square. So you had this idea of this kind of almost like a court gesture. There was never anybody who was just kind of gay and normal. Yeah. And there was no, this is pre-internet. This is pre-Oprah. This is pre-support groups. This is like, there was no, I don't think sometimes people can understand what it was like growing up when we grew up. There was no understanding, no empathy at all for gay people. If anything, it was kind of the worst thing that you could be as a boy, really. At the end of the day, that's certainly the way that I felt. So for my parents to kind of try to guide me towards a path that they felt was the more acceptable or the better path, I could understand where that thinking came from. I could understand that they were a product of their generation as well, and they were only repeating what they had learned themselves. That wasn't the end story between my parents and myself, thankfully. But during those early years, they didn't have any frame of reference, so they just kept repeating the same kind of ignorant attitudes that they had been brought up with as well. So that's why I kind of paint a picture. It's painful for me to think of that conversation with my dad, knowing where we ended up in our lives with me coming out and them joining PFLAG and becoming very, very vocal and very present in my life. Yeah, but that's where they started from as well. And so it's a bit painful for me to go back and talk about those chapters where they were in ignorance as well, because that's not where they ended up, in our relationship as we go.
And a very confusing time, and it would have been perhaps socially embarrassing for your parents.
Oh, absolutely.
To be I remember when with the gay kid.
Well, listen, when I came out, my parents went into a closet. Like I felt like I think I understood a little bit of what I had gone through, because it was, well, what are our friends going to think? What are the neighbors going to think? If you had a gay child, you had a child who was not, going the usual typical path. And that sometimes is a reflection of who you were as parents. So I think that they felt vulnerable to the judgments of other people, that people would point the finger at our family and say, well, they obviously did something wrong with Brian, or his mom was too much this way, or his dad was too much that way, or whatever, because look at how he turned out. And I think that it made me realize how vulnerable they were to their friend groups as well, that people were going to judge our family because I was gay.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's talk about school spaces. You, despite the fact you said at one point that you weighed more than 100 kilos by the age of 12, so you were like 200 pounds or something. Am I right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. That's right.
So eating is definitely part of it. But then, strangely or oddly, you never ate in the school cafeteria. Why?
No, I didn't. I was afraid to be in the school cafeteria because my friend group was primarily girls, and I didn't want to be sitting at a table to be seen sitting at a table, because I was afraid that was going to draw a certain amount of attention to myself. And so I would prefer to be alone and away from everyone's eyes than to be highly visible. And I think that's the same with a lot of queer kids, in that they might not be dealing with the same specific issues that I was dealing with, but at the same time, there's this tendency sometimes to withdraw and to remove yourself and to make yourself hidden so that you don't become a target. And as opposed to being out there and being yourself and just being very kind of like I wish I had more courage when I was a teenager. I really do. I think
but we are confused. We are afraid. We feel threatened by other people. We hear disapproval in adult conversations all the time. And as a gay male, I mean, you'd certainly hear it from your father and his friends, and, they were making fag jokes and things like that. And you're just kind of, I mean, what do you do?
Yeah.
But you're surrounded by that. Okay, so that went, that went the way it did. You also talk about in letter 6, I'm mindful of the time because we've got 20 minutes, the Great Gay Divide. Let's talk about that. What's the Great Gay Divide?
In terms of age, I think, right? Was that what that letter was referring to?
I believe so. Is it easy to live in two worlds simultaneously? This was about separating your life.
Oh, that for sure. So what was happening in my own life is when I started to come out, I was still living in my house, like my student house, with my straight friends or straight roommates who didn't know about me. And I started to really, explore my gay self. Like I was going out to like the gay clubs, I was dating. And the more that I got involved and it sort of accepted who I was, the more it created a distance between myself and my friends, because I wasn't ready to come out to them. But it was this moment in time where I stopped the friendship sort of, there was a division, I guess, in the friendship, so that I sort of had my gay world over here where I was going out and had friends and dating. And then I had sort of the quote unquote straight world over here, where I was still Brian, but I was not the same person as I was. And once you sort of turn the corner, you can't go back. Like it's I think in some ways when the train sort of leaves the station, there is no going back to that former life, because you realize this is who I really am. This is my truth. But you need to sort of deal with everybody else's reactions and telling everybody else, because you can't kind of move forward without letting everybody else know that, hey, everybody, this is me.
Do you think that your housemates from university, because you lived with them, most people do this and they live in a house together for a couple or a few years. Do you honestly think they didn't know?
No, I really don't. I really don't. Because the thing is that there was this attitude where I think that it was so removed that somebody that you could be living in a house with could be gay. It was such a, like, gay people were sort of reserved for talk shows like Sally Jesse Raphael, and they were kind of seen as like this other, right? They were other. There was gay people in the world, but they were not sharing a toilet with you. They were not somebody that you were living with. And my roommates and I, we were friends. And so that added another element to it, in that we were close and we were friends with one another. But I think in all honesty, it was so far removed from them that they could be friends with a gay guy, which is, who I was. I really don't think that they suspected. Having said that, looking back, I was the only one in the house that had wallpapered my room, and I painted matching trim to go along with it. And I had an antique bed, and I'm sure the signs were all there, Peter, from the very beginning. Looking back on it now, they're like, that makes a lot of sense for Brian to have painted his room the way that he painted it. But anyway, they didn't know.
But you waited. You didn't come out until after you left the house. Is that right?
That's right. I figured it would be too problematic if I was in the house at the time when I came out, because I had no idea how they were going to react to it at all. Like it was really just throwing caution to the wind, really, because there was no way to gauge it. I figured it was safer, not safer in a dangerous kind of way, but safer in terms of a school
social reaction.
Focus. Yeah, exactly. That if we were apart when I told them.
And did anybody say like, duh, Brian, like we knew all along?
No.
Nobody did. You were very good then.
Well, I don't think it was me being good. I think it was them being really ignorant. Like, I think they just did not think. When I look back on it, there was a lot of things that I was like, how did you not know that I was gay? Like, there were so many telltale things. But people would say,
like
well, I just
had
thought
like
they were
Holly Hobby wallpaper, right?
Exactly. But people would say, well, they were just kind of Brian things. Like, I didn't think that they were gay things. And I think this was kind of the equation sometimes that people didn't always make. I don't want to make stereotypes. Like, I don't want to say, well, I acted this way. How could you not know? But at the same time, I think it was just so far removed from their reality in a lot of ways, and that it never crossed their mind that I was.
That this would happen. Okay.
No.
Now you're talking about trust on page 117, and you say it means everything and it means nothing. But for young people who are forced in a way to lead double lives, is trust important?
Oh, I mean, you have to be able to trust people. I mean, this was the thing when I was coming out. I was trusting people with my secret life, and trusting that they were not going to out me, trusting that they were not going to put me in a situation that I wasn't prepared to be in. So in that way, trust was something where I needed to put my trust in people, but it was also the thing that I was most afraid to put my trust in others as well, because it was the thing that was the most pressing issue of that time, was and allowing yourself to be vulnerable in front of other people, which I had never done that before.
It could be weaponized if something went wrong in a relationship, or someone could just make a decision. I think which year were you in school? Did you wait till after school to come out, or were you still in school?
I was in school. So I came out when I was 21. So that would have been 92.
Okay. So, well, me earlier, but definitely something similar. But I'll tell you, you got to do it on your own terms. I was outed by my eldest sister sitting in Le Paradis restaurant with my parents on Bedford Road.
Wow.
And she said nothing. I was very busy at school and completely overwhelmed. And the only reason I went to dinner was because it was a free dinner in a nice restaurant. And when we finished, I thought, okay, now we can get out of here and I can go home, and I've got so much on. And then my sister turns to my parents and says, I think Peter's got something to tell you.
Wow. Oh.
in a crowded restaurant.
Wow. So did
And
you said it?
I
Like,
had no choice. I had no choice.
and
Uh,
how did that go over in the restaurant,
well, I
that
mean,
news?
there was no rage or tears or anything, but we were, like we were in a crowded place, so there was not going to be a scene. But I had been told a few years before that. I remember once going with my mother to the dermatologist, and I was driving, and she's talking about their friend's son who came out in university, about 5 years or so older than me. And as I'm driving along on a busy road, and then she sort of says to me, if that ever happened to you, it would break my heart, and I don't know what I'd do.
Mm,
So I don't know how many other kids hear that message from their parents. It's kind of like a warning and kind of like they want to protect you, but they're
yeah.
kind of telling you don't do it, right? Is that helpful?
Well, I think sometimes it's them also projecting a lot on what it means, right, to be a queer person in this world. And I get that there are struggles, and I get that, that the concern can be behind it. I think sometimes it's genuine concern, and I think other times it's control, right? It's them trying to, again, steer you in a direction like my parents tried to with the Barbie doll, which trying to steer you in a direction that is the least amount of pain or heartache or whatever, without stopping to consider that to not live your true self causes far more damage, I think, and pain and heartache than to be who you truly are.
And, well, it does lead to all kinds of things. People who put themselves in difficult situations. A lot of queer people are not encouraged in school. I'm surprised I got a doctorate, because a lot of people don't go to school. They don't feel like the school is waiting for them. People don't encourage them to go. So I think, things have changed somewhat, and
Mm,
somewhat for the better since we were young people. But it certainly wasn't, an easy process. But I think, what would you say to people who are considering coming out? Because I got a lot of gender diverse students, and we're all over the shop, and that's terrific. But people then tell me about preferred names and pronouns, but they won't live it. And they're about the age we were when we came out. What would you advise them?
I think, the only advice I could give anybody is to really listen to yourself. I know it's challenging, but to drown out the noise pollution of the world around you. And I think it's even worse now, certainly with social media, and there's access to resources, but there's also more access to ignorance, I think, out there as well, right? And opinions that, make you feel, you know, that second guess yourself.
And
I think
they're
sometimes no, I
sorry,
just think you
go
sometimes
ahead.
you have to remove yourself from the noise of the world as much as possible,
Mhm.
and really listen to who you are and what is your truth, and to respect that, and to not question, who you are, or to question whether or not who you are is right or wrong. I think that that's something that you just inherently know. And I think if you are able to focus in on that, then good things will follow. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think listening to your own voice, for me anyway, growing up, was the thing that I didn't do, that I wish I had done more of. So I would say probably that's maybe one piece of advice. But everyone is so different, and I think there's just in many ways, it's such a different world too for younger people. I can't imagine some of the struggles that a lot of them are dealing with. And sorry, I cut you off there.
No, no, that's fine. But it was, yes, and I think the hesitation, it still hasn't changed. Identity formation is still a tough process, no matter if it's 1994 or 2024. Um, and I think, what I want, young people who are going to view this to take away from it is that, it's very liberating to live as your authentic self
Mhm.
and to be accepted as your authentic self. But of course, you have to seek allies, and community. And luckily, in today's very connected world, it's a lot easier. We didn't have, I mean, people might think that we lived in caves, but there were no cell phones, there was no internet.
Nope.
How were you going to meet people, right? Everything was word of mouth, but very clandestine and very quiet because things could go wrong, right? And I think a
It's
lot of
very
people,
true.
and people also sort of take refuge when they may not come out in their own community or in their own, say, small local culture. People therefore migrate to the larger cities to become queer, right?
Yeah.
And I think you see a lot of that. I did when I was growing up. You see a lot of that. People living in, who come to the city after school or after whatever else and start this new life as this queer person.
But
Right.
even that, I mean, I think sometimes too, like you can still be within a community as well and still feel lonely and still feel like that you're not connecting in a way that you want. Like I think for me coming out, it meant like it was all going to be like unicorns and rainbows and glitter when I finally came out, and it wasn't that at all. I mean, it was still a struggle. Like I still had I had trouble connecting with other people. It was, and that can sometimes make you feel even lonelier at times, because here you are now, you finally sort of come out to yourself and you're sort of putting yourself in the company of other people who can understand, or who have some sort of, you have a connection with in a way that you didn't with other people leading up to that point in time. And yet sometimes it can still be a struggle to make those connections still within your own communities, like it's not always easy either. So I think people sometimes struggle if they move to a larger city or they come out or whatever, and they think that that's going to be the answer. And sometimes it's not always the answer we want it to be either. There's still struggles ahead, unfortunately, for many of us too.
I always used to say to people, you can buy a new pair of clothes and you can look different, but you're still the same you.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
tell my students, you have to be the hero of your own story, because no one's going to do it for you.
Yeah,
no one's going to
it's
do
very
it for
true.
you.
Yeah, very true.
So, your best years. When have your best years been? You talk about that near the end of the book in letter 11. You talked about your last moments with your mother. I'm sorry for your loss. But then you talk about blender years, but also page 184, the best years. What do you think your best years were or are?
Well, I would say probably best years looking back on it decade wise was probably my 40s. I think I do look back on my 20s, and I kind of want to go back in some ways. I want to go back to a night at the club. Like I want to go back to that like cheesy 1990s dance music where I feel like I'm out at 3 o'clock in the morning and the world is sort of just wide open for me. I do miss that.
And then you can go to Franz after.
Yeah, exactly. And I do miss that kind of that feeling that Saturday night was going to potentially lead you anywhere, right? Who knew what was going to happen when you went out? So there's a part of me that misses that, but I also do not want to go back either necessarily to that. So I would say probably for me, I mean, I'm 53 now, so I'm still into my 50s, but I would say my 40s were probably when I felt grounded the most, when I felt like I had dealt with a lot of the baggage that I had growing up. I'd sort of worked through my issues. I was in a relationship that I was happy to be, like I just felt like I was myself. And I know probably, in my 20s, 40 seems like it's old, in a way, how it is, right? I mean, it's all perspective. But I was just happy and I was content with who I was in that decade. And I'm so happy and content with who I am now. I'm just kind of aging more and more every year. I'm not quite prepared for that.
It happens to
I'm not quite prepared for it. As much as I kind of like go along for the ride, I'm like, yeah, I've got a good life. There's still the aging thing where it's like going out and buying some of the creams. I'm like, I'm afraid.
You don't get tequila, you go get like Botox.
Exactly. I'm afraid. The thing is with the whole like anti-aging stuff, it's like, I don't know if it works, but I'm afraid not to use it. Because then if you don't use it, you're going to look like, 105 or whatever. So there's this kind of mindset sometimes as you age, like this idea that you have to fight against time or whatever. But then there's another side of me was just kind of like,
that's tyrannical. That's letting them get to us and tell us how to live, right?
I know. I was watching a Pam Anderson interview the other day on TV, and she's, going makeupless or whatever. And it's just, it would be so great if we could just sort of move towards this kind of idea of just sort of everyone's accepting themselves at whatever stage they're at. And I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just, we live in a youth-based society, right? In a lot of ways, you see it everywhere you go, and, anyway.
Sarah Jessica Parker said the same thing. And she said, I know what I look like. What am I supposed to do about it? Go get facelift?
Yeah.
She said, I'm happy with who I am at my age.
Yeah.
So,
well, then you have to be happy with yourself at the end of the day.
Would you like to be your teenage self again if it were now?
I think I would appreciate an awareness that I didn't have back in my teenage years. I think I would probably feel less alone today as a teenager, but I don't know. I think there are different pressures. I think there's different stresses. I think it's a different world in a lot of ways. than it was for me. So maybe in some ways I had it better than the youth of today, and maybe in some ways I had it worse. I think it's always a bit of a mixed bag too.
Well, and we didn't live in a wired world, and that's not something that we can change.
No.
But the thing is, we actually had to go out and meet people in person. If you wanted to meet somebody, you had to go to the places, and you had to
Yep.
talk with people, and you had to get to know people, and you had to break into social groups. And we've lost all that.
Yeah, I think so. I think in a lot of ways we have. Yeah, for sure.
Mhm. I see Chrysula's back, and I think we're going to have to leave it there with the questions. So first of all, hey Chrysula, first of
Hi.
all, I would like to thank, of course, you, Brian, for agreeing to do this. And I hope you're able to use our video will be posted and published. And if they don't send it to you directly, which they probably will because they're magnificent, I will send it to you, and you can have your publisher or your webmaster put it on your website. I'd like to thank Chrysula Banak for participating with us and acting as moderator. Chrysula is heterosexual and a mother of two, and she's one of the coolest people I know. And we're good friends, and I'm not pretending she's my girlfriend. And I'd also like to thank the people from Special Events and VFairs, because this all looks really slick. I would not at all have known how to do this. So that is Shelley Barr, who's the director, Kristen, who's been with us today, Vanderwater, and Michelle Colasano, who did our design for us. I'd like to thank also from Special Events, Hamzas, the two Hamzas, Hamza Khan and Hamza Sultan, who helped with all the tech in the lead up to this. And finally, I'd like to thank the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and especially my boss, Stephanie Sambu, for agreeing to let me do this and encouraging me, and for funding it and making sure that we're increasing queer presence at Sheridan.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Peter, for leading the talk today. If there are no other questions, then I guess we'll be signing off shortly.
Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Brian. And I know you have a very busy life right now, and I don't know if you're working on a new project, but it would be nice to eventually meet in person, and have a longer discussion, because it's generational and our experiences are so similar. I too had a weight problem as a young person. I too had a constipation problem as a young person, as like all that stuff you mentioned.
Yeah.
Right? That all happened to me at exactly the same ages. So
Yeah.
very interesting.
Well,
All right.
listen, you put yourself out there, and I think sometimes it can feel at times that you're putting out a lot of details about your life, and you think, who's going to connect with this, or who's going to, like, people are going to read this and say, wow, what a strange person. And then you connect with other people, say, I had this too. Or you're out walking your dog, and the topic of gynecomastia, however you say it, yes, exactly, comes up, and somebody says, oh, I had that too. And I think that's the one thing that with memoirs, or just sharing your stories, regardless if it's in a book form or whatever, sometimes when you put yourself out there and you make yourself vulnerable, you find people respond, because that's where you find the connections. But I understand sometimes it's vulnerable.
I'm not the only one.
Yes, exactly. For sure.
Right?
Yeah.
It's sort
There's
of like
nothing else.
reading your first queer book or novel. Like I read Giovanni's Room, and it's like, oh my goodness, I'm not the only one. Anyway.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think it's 3 p.m. or 1500. So I think that's it for our interview, Brian. It's been a really great pleasure meeting with you, and we're not done. I'd like to continue the discussion at some other time. Brian and I already connected on Instagram. So anyway, yeah, we will be in touch soon with the buffered recording. I thank you for taking time. Do you have any last questions or comments for us?
No, I just think it's great that Sheridan is doing this. I think it's a great opportunity for, to introduce, like, to give a platform for different voices and different perspectives. And I'm happy to have gotten the invitation. And I wish you all the success for your future events that you're having.
Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you, Chrysula. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.